The constellation floated on silver wings across the bright winter sky of North Korea. Below, the Yalu River traced a path across the rugged landscape. A grizzled face, corncob pipe jutting from the mouth, peered out the window at the shooting star jets sent to protect the plane before glancing down at the men fighting below. From this height, he surely could not tell which side was which, and he definitely could not tell which side was winning. But deep down, he knew that his boys would again bring him glory. They always had. Douglas MacArthur was not a man that could lose. Hello, and welcome to Coming Together, Coming Apart, Episode 23, Give Me Tomorrow. Before we begin, I want to ask for a donation. Not to me, not to the podcast, but to an organization called Urban Gateways. Urban Gateways is a Chicago-based nonprofit that connects youth with different arts programs. So your donation will help fund virtual lessons, virtual performances, and opportunities for teachers to learn ways to use the arts to connect with their students. You'll also help fund the Street Level program, which gives teens the opportunity to engage in different multimedia projects, including podcasting. If you donate, you will have my eternal gratitude, as well as a shout-out in the next episode. Today, I want to thank our listeners James and Kim for their donations. Your support means a lot to me, and it means a lot to the young people of Chicago that you're helping. I also want to thank Mrs. CTCA for her donation, but I don't think she listens to this, so I've also told her in person. She hears enough of my voice as it is anyway. If you'd like to donate, you can find the link to donate in the description for this episode and on our social media pages. Any amount helps, and I thank you in advance. Given that this Thursday is Thanksgiving in the United States, I think it is fitting to start off discussing the Thanksgiving of 1950. In the United States, Thanksgiving falls on the fourth Thursday of November, and in 1950, that Thursday was the 23rd. The weather in late November in northern Korea is bitterly cold, so the American commanders of the United Nations forces needed something that would raise morale across the board. It was decided that a nice, hot Thanksgiving meal would do the trick. No expense was spared in ensuring that between Thanksgiving Day and the following weekend, every UN soldier in Korea, including non-Americans, had a full turkey dinner, complete with mashed potatoes, stuffing, and pumpkin pie. It would be the last moment of respite for these troops for some time. As his men were chowing down across the peninsula, Douglas MacArthur's Lockheed Constellation, which he of course christened the Bataan, took off from Sinanju Airfield. Once aloft, he directed the pilot to turn north and follow the Manchurian border out to the Sea of Japan. The pilot hesitated, worried that it was too risky with a Supreme Commander aboard. Nevertheless, Douglas persisted. A fighter escort was requested and arrived after a short wait, with the large aircraft loitering off the North Korean coast. MacArthur and co. then banked north, then east, sailing over the great mountainous expanse that stretches from the southern tip of Korea up through Manchuria and into Siberia. Small pillars of smoke rose up from those villages and towns destroyed by the U.S. airmen and naval aviators. Nearing the Soviet segment of the Korean border, the Bataan angled south towards Japan, breaking away from its escort and returning MacArthur to his Tokyo sanctuary. The 70-year-old general had no idea he would soon face the greatest challenge of his storied career. As we discussed at the end of episode 21, on the 24th of November, the United Nations Command began its Home by Christmas offensive. The day after that, the 25th, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army began its second phase offensive. As a reminder of the plan for the Home by Christmas offensive, the 8th Army was to advance north in the west, X-Corps was to advance north in the center, or just east of center, and the 3rd and Capital Divisions of the Republic of Korea Army were to advance northeast towards the Soviet-Korean border. These actions were expected, if not to crush KPA resistance, then at least to push any remaining Korea People's Army presence into Manchuria. Those actions pretty much went as scheduled on the 24th, with UN soldiers filling the gap between lines from which the People's Volunteer Army had retreated. It was not until the 25th that problems began, with encounters popping up all over the place as large masses of Chinese soldiers smashed into the advancing UN columns. As PVA commanders planned, the 38th and 42nd Armies would surround 3 ROKA divisions around Wuchang in the west. One division of the 42nd Army would then sweep around behind the ROKA divisions to trap them in a vice grip. The 38th Army would then turn west and force the 8th Army's front back south. The 39th, 50th, and 66th Armies were to attack each flank of the 8th Army along the western sector, surrounding them or forcing them either back to Pyongyang or into the sea. In the east, the divisions of the 9th Army Corps were to march on the U.S. Marines at Changjin Reservoir and push the ROKA out of northwestern Korea. According to historian Billy Mossman's Ebb and Flow, the official U.S. Army history of the war from November 1950 to July 1951, 30 total PVA divisions were in Korea at this time. Multiple sources have those divisions containing at least between 150,000 and 300,000 soldiers, but I'm inclined to believe the higher end of that spectrum. 18 divisions were in the west and 12 were in the east, compared to 12 UN divisions in the west and 5 in the east. I very quickly want to say that there were also British, Australian, Indian, Thai, Filipino, Turkish, and Dutch units alongside the Americans and Koreans by this point in the war. Their contributions cannot be overlooked, and don't you worry, they will not be overlooked. I'll actually spend nearly an entire episode on the UN coalition sometime in the future, once this mobile portion of the war has calmed down a bit. Total UN forces in Korea numbered about 550,000, but that includes every person under the UN command across the entire peninsula, including the air services, even those based in Japan, the naval services, and all support staff. We don't know how many support personnel the PVA had in Korea or Manchuria, especially because they had a habit of recruiting locals for their supply chains, literally walking supplies up to the front in between engagements. In terms of combat troops, the PVA held the advantage by about 3-2, to give you a better idea of how things would look heading into the last days of November. The second phase offensive began on the morning of November 25th. The day was cold and windy, and already a not insignificant number of Chinese soldiers were dead from exposure, frostbite, and hypothermia. Their uniforms were generally well insulated, but many lacked gloves of any kind or boots thicker than their thin rubber-soled sneakers. This was a problem, but it was not a disastrous one for PVA command. Most units were still at fighting strength, so the attack could continue unabated. The first blow came from the 114th Division of the 38th Army, who struck the front of the ROKA 7th Division in the early morning light. The 114th's sister divisions, the 112th and 113th, wheeled around to pin the 7th Division, trapping the ROKA soldiers and pummeling them into submission by the end of the day. All across the Western Front, this process repeated itself, with entire PVA armies, comprised of 3 to 4 divisions apiece, engaging, trapping, and smashing ROKA and U.S. Army divisions as those divisions marched forward. Peng Dewai's trick of releasing prisoners with false information about the state of the PVA's quote-unquote retreat had worked to perfection. All across the front, the first day of Chinese action threw the UN forces into chaos. Before his offensive even began, MacArthur was wowing the international press in Tokyo with the magnitude of his success. Of course, that couldn't be true because, again, the offensive had not begun, but there's no way it could go wrong. He had flown over the front himself. He had seen things with his own eyes. Confidence all across the front was also very high among American commanders. Ned Almond, commander of X-Corps, visited the Marines at Changjin Reservoir to present them medals when he encouraged them to, quote, not let a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop them, end quote. Below them, though, the commanders on the ground, the lower-ranking officers actually marching with their men, were starting to get a bit worried. Supplies were increasingly harder to come by, and, for example, around the reservoir, Marine Commander Oliver Smith was concerned that they were too isolated with the 8th Army units they were to connect with 80 miles to the west. The cold also wore heavily on the Marines, adding another dimension of difficulty to their advance. Almond was unshaken by Smith's concerns, though, and ordered them to move north on the 27th. The first cataclysmic reports of the PVA offensive and subsequent UN collapse arrived on MacArthur's desk on the afternoon of the 28th. He ordered an immediate withdrawal of all UN forces across the peninsula, including those Marines Almond had just recently ordered to advance. In his cables to Washington, there was a not-before-seen sense of panic in MacArthur's tone. He truly did not expect such a strong Chinese response, despite the warnings he had received from internal and external players. Of course, publicly, this was another masterstroke of the old general, with his official press statement explaining that the Chinese offensive had been muddled and provoked prematurely by the UN offensive. MacArthur immediately argued that he be given an increased number of divisions and allowed to make aerial incursions against Chinese supply lines in Manchuria, which would represent a large expansion of the conflict. This aggression was typical of MacArthur, but his panic was already undeniable. As he presented this message to reporters, Generals Walker and Almond were on their way to Tokyo. Over the course of a 4-hour meeting, a record of which was not kept, the three generals met with several other commanders to discuss the worsening situation. The order for withdrawal was reaffirmed, despite both Walker and Almond assuring MacArthur that their lines could hold if given enough time to regroup and reinforce. Time had run out, though, and once again the anti-communist forces were on the retreat. Like the response in Tokyo, the initial response to the offensive in Washington was disbelief, then panic. The National Security Council held an emergency meeting on the 27th to discuss the best way to move forward. At that meeting, Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Secretary of Defense George Marshall agreed that no action could be taken against Chinese territory lest it cause a further widening of the war, drawing in the Soviets. Other than that agreement, the men in the room could make no recommendation to Truman. The situation was still developing, and it was thought, for the most part, that things were best left to the commanders on the ground, for now. Truman stated as much in response to a question from a reporter, saying, quote, "Responsibility for the use of weapons ordinarily rests with the field commander," end quote. Somewhat unfortunately for Truman, the question was specifically about the use of atomic weapons, which would represent the widest possible expansion of the conflict, of any conflict. And the White House later clarified Truman's statement, saying that final authorization for the use of atomic weapons was the president's responsibility and had not been given. But the cat was kind of out of the bag already over in Tokyo. MacArthur was big on the A-bomb and would request a general authorization for the use of atomic force on December 9th and again on the 24th, with a specific request for 26 atomic bombs. We'll talk more about the A-bomb and MacArthur in a few weeks, but it's important to at least keep in the back of your mind that at the time, the A-bomb was seriously considered by some in Tokyo and Washington as the best way to bring the Korean War to a quick finish. A drastic action which, for now, Truman did not want to take again. The second phase offensive was comprised of three main actions then: Battle of Chungcheon River, the Battle of Changjin Reservoir, and the Second Battle of Pyongyang. Let's talk about each individually. The Battle of the Chungcheon River is the name given to that first week of action in the West, and is almost entirely just the beginning of a full retreat of the 8th Army. Every division in the 8th Army, both American and Korean, faced relatively heavy casualties on that first day of combat, then fought minimal rearguard actions. Most every unit faced some combat as they slowly fell back on the Chungcheon River. They then began moving further south because the 8th Army's commanders, Walker chief amongst them, were worried by the threat of total envelopment. If the Chinese were able to get behind his forces, Walker feared that they would not be able to withdraw enough men out of the west coast ports to sustain the war further south. The withdrawal was so large, so complete, and so quick that there were actual full-on traffic jams heading south towards Pyongyang and beyond. Any hopes of forestalling a total collapse in this sector of the front vanished nearly as soon as they appeared. The PVA's march was constant and unceasing, but never close enough to cause disastrous damage, but still left the UN forces no choice but to withdraw further south quickly to mitigate the effects of expected PVA attacks from the east, trying to push them into the sea. The Battle of the Chungcheon River was the opening salvo of the second phase offensive, ending in success for the Chinese volunteers on December 2nd, with the 8th Army collapsing before them. Some of you might know the Changjin Reservoir as the Chosin Reservoir. That's what the Americans called it back then, because that's what the man-made lake was labeled on their old Japanese colonial maps. but I'll stick to the Changjin Reservoir because that's the Korean name for the lake and for the battle. It's kind of a Manassas Bull Run situation, if any of you are American Civil War nerds. The Battle of Changjin Reservoir is one of the most stunning battles in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. This was only partially because of the strength of the enemy the Marines faced up in those mountains. The Chinese were strong, with 12 divisions facing off against X-Corps forces in and around the reservoir, but the cold was even stronger. Temperatures plummeted as a cold front passed over the sector, dropping as low as negative 35 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 37 degrees Celsius. These were truly Arctic conditions, as winds whipped across the lake and down the valleys, with guns, vehicles, and even medical supplies freezing. Men could not even remove one piece of clothing, lest skin immediately become frostbitten upon contact with the biting air. Metal ground against metal as lubricants froze, rendering most things mechanical unusable unless properly warmed. Men slept with rifles and canteens in their sleeping bags when sleep was possible. And many times, though, sleeping and the lack of movement it entails was a death sentence in and of itself. The fighting men on both sides of frozen Chosin, as the Marines called the place, were fighting two ferocious enemies, their mortal enemy and their meteorological enemy. When the Marines of X-Corps began their advance on November 27th, they had no idea what they were marching into. The plan was for the 1st Marine Division to split into two groups and march around the Changjin Reservoir in northeastern Korea towards the Yalu. The first day went relatively well, with the Marines occupying a few hilltops on their way north. Then, an observation plane spotted a massive contingent of Chinese soldiers immediately ahead of the Marines. On the evening of the 27th, the Chinese struck the exposed Marines around the village of Udamni, southwest of the reservoir. East of the reservoir, an Army Regimental Combat Team's defenses centered just north of the village of Hudongni. South of the reservoir, one road stretched from the village of Hagaru-ri at the reservoir's southern end to Hungnam on the east coast. Between the night of the 27th and the morning of the 29th, 6 PVA divisions launched attacks from the north and west, attempting to surround and cut off the 1st Marine Division from its only escape route. Initially, the PVA successfully cut off the road a few miles south of Hagaru at multiple points, and would continue to reseal the road whenever either northward relief efforts or southward escape efforts opened the road briefly over the next 2 weeks. The Marines at Changjin Reservoir had some guardian angels watching over them, launched from nearby Yanpo Airfield and 5 U.S. Navy aircraft carriers in the Sea of Japan. Close support flights, largely flown by Marine pilots in the distinctively gull-winged F-4U Corsairs, dropped napalm, conventional bombs, and heavy machine gun fire onto Chinese units. These flights were only effective when the skies were clear enough, though, to spot the Chinese volunteers in their white quilted uniforms against the backdrop of fresh fallen snow. When the fighting was close or visibility was just poor enough to be an issue, the Corsairs would sometimes drop ordnance on their fellow Marines. Napalm is a horrendously inhumane way to die, which means that some Marines would shoot their friends burned by napalm to end their suffering. At MacArthur's meeting with Walker and Almond, X-Corps' new orders were to retreat and regroup around Hungnam. The first stage of this plan was for all forces around the reservoir to gather around Hagaru. The airstrip there would allow supplies to be flown in and casualties to be flown out, crucial when the road connection was inconsistent and dangerous. Even then, that was difficult for some of the units around the reservoir. The Army Regimental Combat Team, RCT-31 in the east, better known today as Task Force Faith, had faced heavy attacks from PVA forces since the beginning of the offensive and was effectively cut off from Hagaru. Company by company, the soldiers moved slowly back towards the southern end of the lake, pinned by the Chinese to the lakeshore. Because of the deep cold, the lake was frozen over, allowing some men to break away and make the treacherously exposed walk across the ice to their destination. Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, after whom the task force is today named, performed multiple heroic acts leading his men south, always leading them from the front. He was killed in action on December 1st aboard a supply truck attempting to dash through a village on their path. Just 1,000 of the 2,500 under his command made it to Hagaru. On the west side of the reservoir, 2 regiments of Marines fought their way out of Udamni, clambering over the mountains overlooking the road to Hagaru. They had to push the Chinese off the high ground to ensure the safety of the vehicles that had no choice but to use the road. By the 4th of December, the 1st Marine Division and its attached units were gathered in Hagaru, preparing for the final push down the mountains to the coast. Between the 1st and the 5th, 4,300 casualties were airlifted out of Hagaru, allowing General Smith, the commander in charge of the 1st Marines, to begin the full evacuation to Hungnam. Despite an offer by the commander of the Far East Air Force's Combat Cargo Command to airlift out all of his men from Hagaru, Smith decided that a ground retreat was the best option. That's because the FEAF could only airlift out the Marines, leaving their equipment behind. Smith had been authorized to destroy his division's equipment by Almond, but chose the more difficult path. Now, I'm not entirely sure why he chose that path, to be honest. Whatever his reasoning, though, his superiors accepted it, and the 1st Marines of the reservoir began their retreat to Kotori, 8 miles south, on the morning of December 6th. It took 2 days of heavy fighting along the road and neighboring mountains for the column to reach the village. Artillery was leapfrogged down the road to ensure constant coverage. 24 close support planes flew at all times, rotating out as fuel and munitions ran low. As Smith prepared to leave for Kotori himself, his scouting reports placed 2 PVA divisions between his location and his destination. 2 more divisions sat in wait just south of Kotori, blocking the 10 miles of road between that village and Chinhungni. A breakthrough effort was made running north up the road to break the roadblock. At Kotori, the garrison commander, the famous Marine commander Chesty Puller, which is an incredible name for a person, even if it is just a nickname, was able to fly all casualties out of the village by the 9th, allowing for an easier withdrawal down the mountain road. That's the same Chesty Puller who, during this battle, said, quote, "We've been looking for the enemy for some time now. We finally found him. We're surrounded. That simplifies things." End quote. That same reasoning is why Smith described this evacuation not as a retreat, but as an advance in reverse. Once you're surrounded, it's impossible to retreat, so every movement is an advance. About 3 miles south of Kotori, the Marines had a problem they couldn't just shoot to solve. The Chinese had destroyed a bridge over the waters running out of the reservoir, leaving a 16-foot wide impassable gap in the road. Every bridge built over the gap was quickly destroyed by the Chinese, and now new bridges could not quickly be brought up from the coast in time for the evacuation. An impressive logistical effort was undertaken to drop 8 portable steel bridge spans from cargo planes, C-119 boxcars to be exact. The one trial drop failed after the parachutes attached to the span were too small. Specialist parachute riggers were flown over from Japan and attached 2 large chutes to each span. Just 4 were needed by the Marines, which was fortuitous because one of the 8 fell on a Chinese position and another one was damaged, leaving 6 spans for the Marines. The gap was bridged, and one by one the Marines' vehicles crossed and continued on their way. Progress remained slow, though, as UN forces had to fight their way through the landscape alongside the road to ensure the safety of those on the road. By the evening of the 11th, most of the Marines had made it to Majandong. They boarded waiting train cars and quickly rolled down to Hungnam. The Battle of the Changjin Reservoir was over. It is from this advance in reverse that I draw this episode's title. As written by Stanley Weintraub in his book MacArthur's War, a photographer for Life magazine was embedded with the retreating Marines when, on December 10th, he took a photograph of a Marine eating out of a frozen can of beans, ice hanging from his beard. Planning to caption this photo for the magazine's Christmas issue, the photographer asked the Marine, "If I were God, and I could give you anything you wanted, what would you ask for?" The Marine responded with just 3 words, "Give me tomorrow." The Marines fleeing the mountains around the reservoir were men who had already accepted their death, either by cold or by bullet, and were, somehow, relinquished of the burden of their fate. Waiting for those men in Hungnam was a massive evacuation effort. There would be no easy way for them to return south by land, so moving by ship to Busan was the best option. The massive amphibious escape was almost as impressive an operation as the landing at Incheon, requiring coordination between Almond's staff, the war-weary troops standing watch on the perimeter around Hungnam, and those pilots flying overwatch off U.S. Navy carriers. A constant stream of cargo aircraft flew in and out of Yampo Airfield near Hungnam, carrying casualties and equipment out of the danger zone. Chinese attacks were rare, never really testing the perimeter for weakness. Out of Hungnam, 29 ships took over 22,000 Marines to safety in Busan. A further 80,000 U.S. and ROK Army soldiers and 90,000 refugees also embarked on more ships out of Hungnam, Songjin, and Wonsan, aboard a mix of World War II vintage landing ship tanks and commercial freighters. X-Corps had fully evacuated from North Korea by Christmas Day, 1950. Earlier in the episode, I said there was a second Battle of Pyongyang, but that's not really true. By the time the Chinese reached Pyongyang on the 5th, there wasn't really anyone left to keep them out of the city or to make it a battle. The North Korean capital was recaptured by the PVA on the 6th, and that was that. 4 days earlier, UN forces initiated a full retreat back south of the 38th parallel, a retreat that would last until Christmas. The news of Pyongyang's capture delighted Kim, who was in Beijing meeting with Mao, Zhou Enlai, and another Chinese official who's not really important right now. Kim requested of Mao further PVA advances, and Mao agreed that their soldiers had the advantage. It was only right of them to continue pressing that advantage until their enemy collapsed. Mao's goal with that advantage was to reunify the peninsula, but he already thought that might not happen, given what happened back in September. He thought it much more likely that, were the PVA to capture Seoul, the United Nations forces would acquiesce to Chinese demands for imperialist withdrawal from Korea and a freely chosen government for the country. Of course, that country would be communist, but that was just the natural choice of a people grateful for their liberation. Now saved from near total ruin, Kim's head was once again filled with visions of reunification under his Red Star, his control much more total than in those visions of Mao. The scale of the UN collapse was readily apparent when Lawton Collins, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, arrived in Seoul on December 6th. He first met with Walker, who was concerned that not even the 38th parallel could be held. And partially, this was because Walker had just received Plan Number 203 from MacArthur's office, detailing plans for a full UN withdrawal out of Korea to Japan. These plans were never carried out, but it's surprising that MacArthur tolerated such talk. That speaks to the level of his own panic back in Tokyo. Collins was impressed at the organization of the withdrawal in the West, something he expected to find but simply did not in the East. Collins actually thought it insane that Marines were even up around Changjin in the first place, so treacherous was the landscape. When he questioned Almond about it, Almond shifted the blame to MacArthur's orders for a connection with the 8th Army. After meeting with the two generals in the field, Collins returned to Tokyo, which he had visited earlier in transit to Korea. There, MacArthur requested further American divisions or Chinese Republican forces, as well as permission to take direct action against Chinese territory through bombing raids across the border. Collins refused both points, but it was clear to both of the men that this was an entirely new war. For the 8th Army in the West, the entire month of December was one long retreat after the Battle of the Changcheng River. Walker knew from the first days of December that the 8th Army could not manage a defensive line anywhere near Pyongyang, and probably not north of Seoul. This was an organized and coordinated effort to minimize the losses of the massive Chinese offensive by keeping the Chinese from getting behind the 8th Army. As long as the road through Pyongyang to Seoul was open, the 8th Army could escape. Once that road was closed, though, things would become infinitely more difficult. However, the retreat was rapid enough that the path remained open. Over 3 long weeks after December 2nd, the 8th Army was able to fall back to the 38th parallel. One day after the capture of Pyongyang, Mao received a message from the Indian ambassador to the People's Republic, K.M. Panikkar. Panikkar proposed that the PVA and KPA halt at the 38th to allow time for a negotiated settlement. This letter had the backing of a dozen countries in addition to India, who was trying to walk a neutral line between East and West in the early Cold War. Mao saw this as a ruse, an attempt by the Americans to fool him into complacency. He thought Panikar an imperialist dog, even though the role of neutral messenger was not untraversed ground for the Indians. They had tried to play a similar role multiple times before, passing along Chinese threats of intervention in September and October that were ignored by the Americans. It is because of Mao's belief that UN forces were attempting to trick him into stopping at the parallel that he ordered Peng to cross the parallel as soon as possible, on December 13th. Peng was less than prepared for that message, as he proceeded to delay for a few days more on his decision to cross the parallel. His soldiers had just marched hundreds of miles down the peninsula. He wanted to give them a chance to rest, and he wanted to reinforce those units that had been depleted over the last month of fighting. When he finally met with his commanders on the 15th to discuss the way in which they should cross the parallel, he reportedly said that, quote-unquote, political considerations were the reason central leadership was requiring that they cross the parallel. And that's not exactly the language of someone excited to do what their boss is telling them to do. On the 19th, Peng described his reservations in a telegram to Mao. 1. Peng believed the war was slowing down, with a quick ending slowly moving out of sight. 2. Expanding optimism in the communist camp for a quick victory could do more harm than good if that quick victory was not achieved, which, again, Peng did not believe he could do. 3. His men were underfed, undersupplied, and just generally exhausted. Peng stated that this problem would only worsen the further south they went if they moved quickly, and this was the best time to solve that issue before it became a bigger problem. All this convinced Mao, who responded 2 days later that Peng's judgment was correct. Still, though, on December 22nd, the order was given for the Chinese People's Volunteer Army's third phase offensive. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, nearing a Christmas that was sure to be stressful and cold. Next week, we will turn the calendar over to 1951 as the Chinese volunteers continue their march down the peninsula. If you are able, please follow the link in the episode description to the donation page for Urban Gateways. We're just over a quarter of the way to the goal. For those of you who would like to learn more about the specific instances of heroism during the Battle of the Chengjin Reservoir, I highly recommend Martin Russ's book, Breakout. You can most likely find it at your local public library. If you're on social media, you can find this podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.